Yom Kippur. When I'm recording this video, it's only a few days away from now. We're actually in what's known as the 10 days of awe. And there is a Jewish tradition about Yom Kippur that I would like to discuss with you. And before I do that, I realize that many of you watching me have a different opinion of how to properly keep Yom Kippur. And so I'm just going to ask you to give us a moment to share why we do not fast on Yom Kippur. I realize we're in the minority on this idea because the vast majority of Judaism and the Messianic and the Hebrew roots movement indeed fast on Yom Kippur. We believe here at First Harvest Ministries that is actually a violation of the spirit behind Yom Kippur. There is a letter of the law, and then there is an intent of the law. Finding that intent of the law is so very important, sometimes referred to as the spirit of the law. So the first question is, why do you not fast on Yom Kippur? Number one, there is zero biblical commandment to do so. And is that not what Yeshua stayed so angry with the Pharisees for adding commandments to the word of Yahweh that are not there? So I'm going to show you on the screen now the 4 scriptures pertaining to the feast of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And let's look at these scriptures that's on the screen. Ironically enough, you will not find one commandment in any of them to fast. Nowhere. So where does the misconception come from? From that one little phrase, afflict your soul. Sounds pretty severe, afflict your soul. So the Jewish people have taken that to mean that means to fast on the day of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. It's the day of the year when the high priest was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies and there sprinkle the blood on the Ark of the Covenant. A very, very holy day, and one that should never be entered into lightly. However, the Jewish people, unfortunately, was never given the spiritual intent of Yom Kippur. They strictly kept it by the letter of the law, strictly afflicting their soul. However, the word afflict in Hebrew is anah. And the truth is, it's not one definition, as you can see on your screen, that means to fast. Not one. Really, the word humble yourself is the correct translation of this verse. On the day of Yom Kippur, it is a day that you should humble yourself. But why? And that's where the beauty of the whole thing comes in. Remember, Yahweh has never in the Torah ever commanded his people to fast. Not one time. Nowhere in the Torah. As a matter of fact, the first commandment that we find to fast comes from a strange source. As a matter of fact, as you can tell by the verse on your screen in 1 Kings, it was Jezebel that gave the first commandment to fast, because fasting was a pagan practice, because they tried to reach God through hurting themselves and lowering themselves and all of these things. They didn't have a covenant with Yahweh or the God of heaven, so they would fast to try to connect to divinity. And so that is the first mention of fasting. And strangely enough, in the New Testament, we find that the mention of fasting is never a commandment. There's a verse where Yeshua said, and these come out only by prayer and fasting. Can you imagine my surprise when I read the footnote under the word fasting? And the footnote said that word fasting was not in the original text. It was added at a later time, most probably by the Jewish people who had learned how to fast. Where did they learn that? They went to Babylon for 70 years. While there, they learned many of the pagan practices. And it's not until their return with Nehemiah and Ezra that we find they begin to fast in sackcloth and ashes. But in fact, if you look at the scripture on your screen, that was never the fast that Yahweh wanted from his people. As a matter of fact, he considers those fasts to be fasting in vain. And in fact, with these scriptures, he tells you the type of fasting that he wants. So, is it wrong to fast on Yom Kippur? It's never wrong to fast if you want to fast. For diet's sake, if you feel like it crucifies your flesh, then go right ahead. But never on Yom Kippur. Why? Let me explain. All of the holy days are shadows of things still to come that have not happened yet. For instance, Passover has not been fulfilled. It will be fulfilled when Yeshua returns and drinks the cup with us at the wedding. Until then, it's still a shadow of something still to come. That's correct. Now, the Passover represents the betrothal of the bride of Yeshua and Yeshua. Then the Feast of Unleavened Bread denotes separation of the bride or sanctification. And then the Feast of Pentecost represents the vows and the veiling of the bride. And then the bridegroom returns at the Feast of Trumpets, Yeshua himself, and then 10 days later, there is a wedding day on Yom Kippur. It is the day when Hashatan is bound and the bride is free from him to marry another. And it is there on that great celebration day that this is a feast and not a fast. As a matter of fact, Yahweh never called these feasts anything but my feast. Now let me ask you, if you're going to a wedding, do you expect fasting or feasting? Well, on Yom Kippur, we are going to the rehearsal every year for our wedding. And no, we're not coming in sackcloth and ashes. We're not coming fasting. We come rejoicing as the bride getting ready for her wedding day. It's not a day of lamenting or beating your chest or crying out in pity. It is the holiest, grandest, most celebratory day of the year. Why would you fast? As a matter of fact, Yeshua encountered this Pharisaical spirit in Matthew, the scriptures on your screen. Evidently in Jerusalem, in the land of Judea, everyone was fasting on this particular day. We can only assume that this was Yom Kippur, because that is when all the Jews would fast, on Yom Kippur. However, they mention that Yeshua and all of his followers were not fasting like the Jewish people. And so they took issue with that. And they said, why are your people not fasting like us? And he gave the answer that we give to you today. He said, why would they fast? Why would they be sorrowful? Why would they be lamenting when their bridegroom is with them? You see, perhaps in the Old Testament, there was some feasible reason to mourn and fast because they didn't have the bridegroom. But he said, now the bridegroom is here. Why would they fast? But then he gave a warning. He said, but after I leave, many of these disciples will go back to keeping Yom Kippur like you do with fasting. Many of them will return to a mourning period because they don't understand that I'm never leaving them. I am still with them even to the end of the world. And there is a group of people on earth today that understands that he has never left us, that we have the bridegroom. We have him inside of us. Why would we fast? Why would we mourn? Why would we come to Yom Kippur as if we're still waiting for the coming of the bridegroom? For a certain group of people already come, he has already. And therefore we come rejoicing. Because again, there's not one Bible command to do anything other than rejoicing on these beautiful festival days. I hope that helps you understand why we choose to keep the spirit of Yom Kippur rather than just the letter. God bless you. Have a great day.